Hello and welcome to this talk on the magic of Venetian glass. Throughout my talk, images that don't have captions will be of glasses in the Wallace collection or otherwise my own personal photographs. It's been proposed that 2022 should be the United Nations International Year of Glass. The recently launched video promoting this proposal celebrates the extraordinary range of uses to which glass can be put. Today, glass has an important contribution to make in a vast array of applications, from home insulation to the bioglass that facilitates bone healing. It's a wondrous material. Nothing testifies to this more vividly amongst historic glass vessels than the products of the Venetian glasshouses from the mid-15th to the mid-17th centuries, the period known as the Golden Age of Venetian glass. At the time, the glasses produced in Venice were held in such high esteem that they were reputed to have magical qualities. Several of the qualities that made Venetian glass so successful are also true of magic. Elements of surprise, secrecy, audacity, meticulous timing, imagination, entrepreneurship, showmanship, and the beholder's bafflement as to how the finished product was achieved. I hope to demonstrate these parallels during this whistle-stop survey of Venetian glassmaking of the Golden Age. The material used by the Venetian glassmakers of the Golden Age was a soda lime silica glass. This is relatively light and, when hot, highly ductile, so it remains workable over a wide range of temperatures, enabling the elaborative manipulation characteristic of Venetian glass. This type of glass has a long history, but the purity of the material sourced by the Venetian glassmakers gave it an almost mythical quality. Here you see a view of the Doge's Palace and the Piazzetta and St. Mark's Square. It provides a clue to some of the factors that gave Venetian glassmakers their advantage. Located at the meeting point between East and West, Venice was a strong maritime power with an empire that gave it access to wide markets. It also gave the Venetians access to a key ingredient in the making of glass of the very highest quality, the most suitable varieties of the plant of the genus Salicornia, which was sourced in the Levant. This produced soda ash, the alkali flux used to lower the melting point of silica, the main constituent of glass. The Venetians had a very pure source of silica closer to home, using ground pebbles from the nearby river Ticino. Another contributory factor to the success of the industry is the fact that it was controlled in minute detail by the Republic's administrative body, the Signoria. This body decreed that glassmaking must be confined to the island of Murano, a short boat ride to the north of Venice, off the further side of the landmass shown in this photograph. This isolation protected the rest of Venice from a greater risk of fire. It also ensured privacy for the production of this special glass from the prying eyes of foreign competitors and endowed it with a sense of secrecy. The ceremonial processions and ritualized events masterminded by the Venetian Republic epitomized showmanship at its most theatrical, enabling the state to show off its pomp and power to full effect. Here, this is manifest in the annual regatta that's taken place in Venice since the 13th century, at least. Such ceremonial events highlighted the aura of luxury and mystique surrounding Venetian glass production. The secrecy associated with the production of Venetian glass, restricted to the island of Murano, also aligned it with magic. In this aerial view map of Venice by de Barbary, produced in about 1500, the snake-like Grand Canal opens into St. Mark's Basin, where behind the giant figure of Neptune, we see St. Mark's Square and the Doge's Palace. And so here is the Grand Canal, and here is this giant figure of Neptune, and immediately behind it, there's the Doge's Palace and St. Mark's Square there. And directly behind them, across a stretch of water at the back of the main landmass, we see the glass-making island of Murano, which is here. In the aerial view of Murano today on the left, you can see the main street, the Fondamenta dei Vetrai, so that's here, or Glassmakers Street, very clearly in the foreground. And you can see also the cemetery island of San Michele here. On the right, we're looking back from Murano's main street towards San Michele there. In addition to being restricted to the island of Murano, Venetian glassmakers were forbidden to work outside Venice on pain of severe punishment for those who flouted the rules, and this added to the mystique of their products. Such were the parallels between Venetian glass and magic that the particular type of glass that was held in the highest esteem, cristallo glass, made in imitation of the natural hard stone rock crystal, was believed to have magical qualities. Venetian glass was prized at the highest level of Renaissance society. In an age when rulers feared being poisoned, the belief that Venetian cristallo would break immediately on contact with poison, or that drinking vessels would change color if filled with poison, meant that it was in great demand. Both the objects in this slide were made in the later 16th century. The tazza on the left is carved from natural rock crystal. That on the right is glass and was probably made in Venice. In the mid-15th century, a new intellectual curiosity about the nature of the material world was beginning to emerge, inspired by the humanist interest in classical texts, such as Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historiae of 77 CE, and also due to more extensive contact with distant lands. There was much interest in minerals, from the princely taste for mounted stones to a fascination with alchemy. There was also great interest in the distinction between naturalia and artificialia, between natural and man-made products. Just as alchemy, the transmutation of base metals into gold, had a quality of magic to it, so did the transformation of hot molten glass into an endlessly varied range of cold, solid forms. Cristallo glass, intended to be as transparent and colorless as possible, was the first product to bring fame for Venetian Renaissance glass around the middle of the 15th century. The discovery of how to make it, using the pure soda and silica sources already mentioned, is credited to one Angelo Baroviere, an experimental glassmaker with a keen interest in natural science. Comparison of the two objects on the screen illustrates the ambition of the Venetian glassmakers. The footed bowl on the left was made in Venice around 1500. The glass is virtually colorless, a feature that's proudly emphasized by the application of dark blue trails to define the limits of its form. Many examples of this bowl type survive, and although they're usually dated to around 1500, they may well have been produced over a longer period. The extraordinary transparency of colourless Venetian glass, and perhaps the popularity of this particular multi-purpose model, is reflected in the early 17th century still life by Giovanni Battista Crescenzi that you see on the right. It shows just such a bowl here at the top there. It shows just such a bowl in use as a fish bowl, the contents of which add life to an otherwise inanimate still life. The sheer ambition of the Venetian glassmakers in the later 15th century really is staggering. Not satisfied with vying with rock crystal for colourlessness, the glassmakers imitated other stones too. On the left here, you see a standing cup and cover made from the natural banded agate, Calcedonio, in around 1480. On the right, a glass goblet in the Wallace collection, which was made in Venice around 1500 in imitation of natural Calcedonio. Glass made in imitation of Calcedony is known as Calcedonio glass. That's the Italian term for it. In his book about Venice, De Situ Urbis Venetae, first published around 1494, Marcantonio Sabellico observed that, quote, "There is no kind of precious stone which cannot be imitated by the industry of the glass workers, a sweet contest of man and nature." Natural chalcedony, with its layers of contrasting colours, was one of the most challenging stones for the Renaissance glassmakers to imitate. The Calcedonio Goblet on the right is a tour de force of Venetian glassmaking. Today, we can't even be certain how it was made. Possibly, the different colours were gathered from separate pots of molten glass. Alternatively, small chunks of variously coloured glass may have been added to the batch of pale green, silver-rich glass used for the first gather, which formed the bowl's interior. So I'm just going to indicate with my arrow, just at the top, you can see just slightly into the interior of this glass, and you see that kind of jade-like colour, which is through the whole of the interior of the bowl. From an apprenticeship contract drawn up in 1460, it seems that the recipe for Calcedonio glass may have been a Barovia family secret. Calcedonio glass was expensive to produce, due not only to the cost of the ingredients, but also to the extended furnace time needed in its manufacture. This was reflected in the very high prices that were paid for it. A merchant in Constantinople in 1473 hoped to sell it in Turkey for 3 times the original cost. The goblet on the left is made in imitation of turquoise. Glass imitations of turquoise were the rarest of the glass imitations of natural stones. The stone turquoise had great curiosity value great curiosity value for people at the time. So it was considered a great achievement that they were able to produce imitations in glass. The vase on the right is latimo glass, and the term latimo describes opaque white glass and is derived from the Italian word latte, meaning milk. Latimo was made in imitation of porcelain, a highly prized commodity made in China and imported into Europe, where the secret of its manufacture was not yet known. Both glasses have enamelled and gilded decoration, which was very popular over a long period from the mid-15th century until the early decades of the 16th century, continuing in popularity abroad for longer. Both glasses are likely to have been special commissions from one of the leading workshops in Murano. The medallion on the latimo glass contains a bust of King Henry VII of England, which was copied from a coin portrait. It's extremely rare for a name of a maker or decorator. It's extremely rare for a name to be associated with individual pieces of glass at this period. Exceptionally, the enamelling on both these pieces is attributed to Giovanni Maria Obizzo. In 1490, Obizzo was named in a glassmaker's legal dispute on Murano as the painter of, quote, more than 1,000 pieces of opaque white glass and other colours, all gilt and enamelled. At the time, enamelled decoration came close to the work of Venice's finest painters. And here, I think you can picture in your mind's eye the work of Vittorio Carpaccio in the period at the end of the 15th, the very early 16th century. You can see probably the influence of his style of painting. This goblet combines several features typical of Venetian glass production around 1500. The bowl has ribbing running halfway up from its base. I'll just point that out here and in the detail in the center here. This is known as mezza stampaura, or half moulding. Like the shallower ribbing that you can see on its foot, this is achieved by inserting a gather of hot glass on the blowpipe into a ribbed dip mould. And down below here in the centre, you can see a view into just such a dip mould. And on the right, you can see the hot malleable glass on the end of the blowpipe is being inserted into a similar mould. The trail of glass encircling the base of the bowl was rapidly applied and tooled to create a milled effect. Let's look at the detail here. So here you can see this milled, so that's really rapidly applied, that trail of glass, and then pincers or another sharp instrument would have been used just to create those projections in it. So it's termed a sort of milled effect. By contrast to the rapid hot working of the glass components, the gilding and enamelling were applied cold. The typical decoration below the rim here comprises a band of gold leaf incised with a horizontally running fish scale pattern, each scale enhanced with an enamel dot. So this is a very typical decoration of Venetian glass around 1500, just below this, this kind of rim border here. Now, a lot of that gilding through handling has become worn. So I mentioned a fish scale pattern. If you look closely, you can see that you can still see the gold quite clearly around the enamel dots here. But the gilding of the entire scale in each case has become worn. So it's what we refer to as ghosted gilding. But you can still see the incised lines through the gold leaf very clearly. So you get an impression of how the scale patterns would have looked. And actually you can also see here a straight line, and that is where the wrap of the gold leaf, where the two ends have met. So after the application of the golden enamel, the glass would be attached to a pontil and returned to the furnace to fuse the gilding and enamels to the glass body. In addition to imitating stones and porcelain, the glassmakers even invented a glass in imitation of a flower meadow. It's known as Fiori glass or thousand flower glass. A wide range of objects were produced from Fiori glass, including the goblet on the left here. And on the right, I'm showing the kind of wildflower meadow that would have evoked the response of creating Fiori glass. And just to say, it's a fabulous meadow, appears on the Isle of Wight in June. So I hope it gives a really good impression of what was inspiring the glassmakers. As enamelled and gilded glass decoration gradually went out of fashion, new technical innovations evolved. Undoubtedly, the most remarkable was the highly successful vetro a filigrana, in which coloured glass canes, usually white, are embedded in the colourless glass. In 1527, the Catani brothers requested a privilege to make glass decorated with twists of cane. Within a few years, the scale of this production must have been considerable, judging by an account written in 1540. In his book, De la Pyrotechnia, first published in Venice in 1540, Vannocchio Biringuccio wrote of the, quote, large things as well as the small, that they make of white or coloured glass, and that seem to be woven of osier twigs equally spaced, with the greatest uniformity and exactness of termination. The more complex patterns, such as that of the small Venetian pilgrim flask dating to the second half of the 16th century that you see on the left, demonstrate the glassmaker's debt to Venetian lacework, which was much celebrated in the 16th century. And so on the right, you can see an example of Venetian lacework of the 16th to 17th century in the Lace Museum on the island of Burano, which is of course the a very famous island in Venice, famous for its lacework. These glasses illustrate two further techniques that became popular from the mid-16th century. The footed covered bowl on the left that you've already seen was made around 1560 to 90. Once the bowl and cover had been made, the piece was passed on for enrichment by the cold decorating technique of diamond point engraving. The Venetian Senate had granted a patent for the use of diamond point engraving on glass vessels to Vincenzo d'Angelo of the Dalgallo glass house in 1549. The bowl of the goblet on the right, which was made in the late 16th to 17th centuries, simulates crushed ice. This is an example of another technique that seems to have been introduced by mid-century, vetro ghiaccio, or ice glass, made in imitation of ice. Ice glass reflects a contemporary interest in ice and iced drinks in Italy. By the late 16th century, fashionable Italians considered ice essential to the enjoyment of dining, especially for wine. Diners must have taken playful pleasure in drinking iced wine from ice glass goblets. Although Venetian glassmakers generally risked serious repercussions from the state if they worked outside Venice, there were occasions when they either flouted the rules or special arrangements were made for them to travel. The footed bowl and cover on the left was probably made in Venice, but it may have been made in Innsbruck in the Tyrol, where Archduke Ferdinand established a court glass house in 1570. He employed Venetian glassmakers who brought molds and some materials with them, and subsequently returned to Venice. More usually, though, patrons beyond Venice commissioned or ordered glass from Venice. The Venetians catered to a market that extended as far as Syria and Egypt. This magnificent pilgrim flask in the Wallace collection testifies to elite German patronage. Unusually, it can be dated fairly specifically to 1523 to 6 because of the form of arms for Christoph Philipp von Liechtenstein. The arms on the other side are for his father-in-law, Wilhelm von Rapolstein of Alsace. Described as a pilgrim flask, because it is described, this form is described as a pilgrim flask because its shape alludes to the vessels in more durable materials that were carried by travelers. And it's playfully equipped with suspension loops through which cord would have been threaded on the leather or metal versions used by travelers, enabling them to carry them easily. So I'll just point out on the left-hand image, I'll just point out the glass suspension loops, which you'll see are gilded. So they serve no purpose on the glass, but they are reminiscent of the suspension loops, which would have been used for threading through the cords on the more hard-wearing pilgrim flasks of this shape that would have been carried by travelers. And you can see on the sides here depictions of just such cords with tassels. So there's a red tassel there, a red tassel down here. And then on the other side, the profile view of that glass, you can see the illusion of the tassels that would have gone through these suspension loops. Glass made beyond Venice, but in the Venetian style, is described as being in the façon de Venise, in the Venetian fashion. These two goblets are characteristic of a small group of 16th century French glasses inspired by Venetian glass, but with idiosyncratic features and a characteristic shared palette, which is predominantly blue, white, and red. A number of them, such as that on the right, have French inscriptions on the themes of love and faith. It's possible that at least some of them were made in the glass house established in Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France in 1551 by a Mourinese glassmaker who was given protection by the French king Henri II. Venetian glassmakers tailored their production to target specific markets. These two glasses, which were probably made in Venice in the later 16th to 17th centuries, illustrate the point made by Richard Lascelles in his book, The Voyage of Italy, published in 1670. Of his visit to Venice, he wrote, quote, "Another day, we went to Murano again to see the glass houses, which furnish almost all Europe with drinking glasses. They seem to have taken measure of every nation's belly and humour, to fit them with drinking glasses accordingly. For the High Dutch, they have high glasses called flutes, a full yard long." And we see an example, not quite a full yard long, but we see an example on the right. For the Italians that love to drink leisurely, they have glasses that are almost as large and flat as silver plates and almost as uneasy to drink out of. You see an example on the left. Just as the art and culture of classical antiquity pervaded elite cultured society in 16th century Italy, so it had a profound appeal for the Venetian glassmakers, influencing the techniques, decoration and vessel forms that they produced. The high-handled, ovoid-bodied ewer was one such shape. It remained fashionable over a very long period. And on the left here, you see a Roman example from the 4th to 5th centuries. In the center, there is a smooth-sided Cristallo example. It's held aloft here in Titian's painting Bacchanal of the Andrians, which was painted in 1523 to 6. The Wallace collection's example on the right dates to the latter part of the 16th century, as is reflected in its more Baroque appearance, combining a pineapple mold-blown body with vetro a retorti decoration. The Venetian glassmakers brought the full force of their skill to bear on creating glasses that conveyed playfulness and humour, much of which was expended on drinking vessels. This covered goblet in the British Museum must have surprised and delighted the drinker when they saw the fishes enamelled on a ball at its centre. The very creation of such a glass must have seemed magical. Renaissance Italians loved jokes involving liquids. This drinking vessel in the Wallace collection, made either in Venice or in the Low Countries in the Façon de Venise around the last quarter of the 16th century, would have intrigued and delighted. The lion at its centre is hollow and bears traces of gilding, and I hope you can just catch the traces of gilding just below the crown on its forehead or at the top of its head. When the bowl was filled with wine and the gilding glittered in the candlelight, this glass must have looked stunning. But the question would be, in polite society, how should you drink from such a glass? There's a small hole on the lion's underside. The lion's hollow tail, now broken, would have functioned as a straw through which the drinker drew up the wine from the bowl through the small hole on the underside of the lion's body. In his wedding feast at Cana, painted in 1562-3, Veronese has transposed the biblical scene to contemporary Venice. In this detail on the left from the painting, the artist has focused attention on the carefully contrived way, just here, so what I'm referring to is just here, the carefully contrived way in which a servant passes a colourless, shallow glass of red wine to the guest seated at the near end of the table. Holding the glass by its foot allows its transparency to be fully appreciated. And you can see there's another similar glass there being used by somebody. The strangely shaped goblet on the right of the screen, which simulates a glass of red wine, makes playful reference to the veneration in which the transparency of Venetian Cristallo glass was held. So it hasn't actually got a liquid in it, of course, but it's got a kind of purpley glass integrated into it, giving the impression of a glass of red wine. A key characteristic of 17th century Venetian glass was the extraordinary dexterity, skill, and imagination shown by the glassmakers. This photo of the renowned expert on historic Venetian glassmaking techniques, Bill Gudenrath, exemplifies the exactitude and skill required to produce the composite glasses that are typical of this period of Venetian glassmaking. The goblet on the left was made in Venice, or the Façon de Venise, probably in the mid-17th century. To make it, great agility and good judgment were crucial. Working at speed, the glassmaker lassoed multiple thin trails of molten glass around the bowl, while ensuring that the glass retained the correct level of viscosity and malleability to be worked. So here you see, I think from memory, there are about 15 rows here of the trail. So you can imagine the speed and dexterity with which the glassmaker had to work to, and they're pretty much parallel. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary feat of glassmaking. The creation of such complex glasses necessitated the use of the glassmaker's chair, which you can see being used in the photograph on the right. The glassmaker constructing and tooling a glass handle in the two photos on the left is seated at a glassmaker's chair. And so what I'll just point out, so he's got, he's working this piece of glass. It's actually, so this is the stem of a glass that he's making. He's making a goblet, that's the stem. And there are handles either side, and you can see he's just applied that outer line of glass, which is still sort of orange hot with the heat. Then here he's working on a different glass, you can see, with a kind of milled outline on the handle here. Working with great dexterity there. And then on our glass, you can see on the far right in this glass of the Wallace collection that it has a really elaborate openwork stem, incorporating two colourless glass seahorses. So I'm just pointing out one of the seahorses here, but there are a pair of them you can see. And then this stem on the Wallace collection glass was achieved through the application of similar dexterity and skill to that shown in the photographs on the left. The spell weave by such exquisite and finely crafted glasses was compelling, resulting in many being immortalized in paint, most often by 17th century Dutch artists, such as this example by Daheem on the right. And I think you can see the close parallel between the Wallace collection goblet and that shown in this still life on the right. And I have to say, I think that beautiful as the one in the painting is, the Wallace collections is even more of a tour de force. By the late 17th century, the Venetian glass industry was challenged by a series of crises. From the 1670s, these included competition from Bohemian potash glass and lead crystal glass, which was initially developed in England by George Ravenscroft. Setting the scene for the 18th century, you see on the left a painting in the Wallace collection by Canaletto's studio. Dating to the mid-century, it depicts the festivities for the Maundy Thursday celebration in the Piazzetta in Venice, with the Doge's Palace on the left. One of the characteristic features of 18th century Venetian glass is the light-hearted exuberance exemplified by the colourful glass flowers adorning a diverse range of glassware. And we have just one example, the very little cruet, very small cruet you can see at the top right here with its colourful, you can see one flower, but there's one, another one on the other side as well. Retaining their skills and adapting them to new products, the glassmakers produced glassware that responded to the fashion for drinking tea, coffee, and chocolate, which developed in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, such as the cup, cover, and saucer set on the right, down here at bottom right, made in the early 18th century. Flower-strewn, multi-branch chandeliers, engraved mirrors, and glass inserts for furniture responded to the new, frivolous Rococo taste. By the end of the 18th century, however, the Venetian glass industry had gone into steep decline, in part due to the political situation in Italy, in part to changing fashions in glassware. Dormant for several decades, it would regain its luster in the mid-19th century, when the rediscovery of the enchantments of Renaissance Venetian glassware would reignite production on Murano and cast a spell over collectors. Thank you.